let's just go for it. Hello everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk with Tom. My name is Tom, and this is the Roundtable. And Space Ghost Coast to Coast is probably like the best show ever. Why? Here's why. Space Ghost Coast to Coast was the first piece of originally produced content on Cartoon Network. Before that, it was basically just a channel that reran Hanna-Barbera cartoons. However, the guy who worked there, Mike Lazo, was like, yo, what if we had our own show? And it's like, we don't have the budget to make our own show. And he was like, well, what if I just took the cells from one of the Hanna-Barbera shows that we had the rights to, because they own the license to all this stuff. What if we just made a show out of that? And thus, we had Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And then that led to every other show that has ever been produced by Cartoon Network or by Adult Swim. Literally, if you have a favorite show that was on Cartoon Network, then it wouldn't exist without Space Ghost Coast to Coast. That's the impact this show had. Like, you like Steven Universe, it wouldn't exist without this show. You like Flapjack, wouldn't exist. Adventure Time, Rick and Morty, NA, Chowder, none of those shows would have ever been made without Space Ghost Coast to Coast. And not only that, but Adult Swim would never exist. For sure. Like, it would never, ever have been made. This was the origin for all of that. It was the origin of Adult Swim's aesthetic, their style, everything that you love about it. This is where it started. And this show, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, deserves to be among the greats. But wait a minute, what is this show about? A superhero who has a talk show with his two worst enemies? Like, there's no overarching plot, there's no story, there's no point. How is this show among the greats? Because you write all this down on paper and it's like, how would this be a good show? But it was. It's what inspired the Eric Andre show, which is probably my favorite show on television today.
Investigate 311.
And the two shows have something in common that makes the surreal, absurd humor with zero plot, zero direction, no continuity work. And that's the format. The formatting understands what it's trying to be. Recently I made a video about Ugly Americans, which is probably up by now. And I said that the main problem with it was the fact that it didn't feel like it was going anywhere, it didn't feel like it had a point, and there was no overarching story. However, with Space Ghost Coast to Coast, you can say the same thing. But the thing is, with Ugly Americans, you have a 30-minute TV show that's pacing itself like it's going to have a story. So it has like an average, kind of slow pace. And then you compare that to Space Ghost Coast to Coast, which has a 15-minute television block, which in reality is about 10 minutes, and they're shoving as much bullshit into that 10 minutes as they can. It has a lot of substance to it, and its goal isn't necessarily to tell a story as much as it is just to entertain you, and it does that pretty well. And with both Eric Andre and Space Ghost Coast to Coast, they're committed to their one-off status. They aren't gonna say like, oh, yeah, there might be something more next week, you know, we're gonna tell a whole little story here. Nah, if they're gonna tell a story, they're gonna start the story in the beginning of the episode, and then by the end, there's gonna be a punchline, and you're gonna feel satisfied. You're gonna feel like it actually meant something. And most of all, Space Ghost Coast is... God, how many times can I say Space Ghost Coast to Coast? And it's a tongue twister. Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Say that 10 times fast. It's not easy. But what it did was it managed to connect with audiences based on the fact that it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen at that point. The look and the aesthetic was rough yet charming, because the way it was made from the animation cells of the original Space Ghost cartoon, the one that they aired back in the 60s. And because it was used from animation cells left over, they had a lot of limitations to work around. They had to look at what they had, and then they had to work from there. If they wanted to show Space Ghost doing a backflip, they had to have an animation cell of Space Ghost doing a backflip. If they didn't have something, then they had to work around it, because they can't just make new animations because they didn't have the budget or the resources to do so. Therefore, when they made the show, they had to ask themselves, how can we make this as good as it can be with what we have? And part of that was finding the right format to do it. They had to find the right style, they had to figure out what the goal was. Most importantly, they kind of had to not take themselves so seriously, which they definitely managed to do. You know, they came up with this idea of a series where the original Space Ghost was retired from superhero work, so he became a late night talk show host, which late night TV was really big at this time, so it's like, hey, pretty good thing to make a parody of. And he also has to work around Zorak and Maltar, who are two people that Space Ghost will not get along with. So then you have the interpersonality conflict going on. And then the big kicker is the fact that Space Ghost just isn't good at his job. He's awkward, he's insecure, he's not that bright, and he's just like tripping over all the testosterone coming out of every pore in his body, making him just a macho parody of himself.
Oh, yeah!
And by parody of himself, I mean parody of the original, I guess. I don't even know what I'm saying. And Zorak and Maltar would regularly get the better of him, usually by outwitting him or being more smooth than him around the ladies.
You are a female human.
Yeah.
You are a pretty female human.
I'm the drummer for Pearl Jam.
Well, I just wrote a book.
Well, I drum for a band.
I'm just a lonely drummer for Pearl Jam.
All right.
That's a lie.
Mantis, don't lie.
And later on, they would bring on new characters like the cast of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and a bunch of characters that would end up getting their own original shows on Adult Swim and Cartoon Network. And they would also bring in old cast members from the original Space Ghost, and they also had the grandfather of Space Ghost, voiced by the iconic Macho Man Randy Savage.
I'm calling you out, crab. I'll show you what you get when you go mano-a-mano with the Grey Ghost. Using a tractor beam on an old man, eh?
And the rest of the show was made up of celebrity interviews, and they had some big names like Hulk Hogan and Weird Al and Fran Drescher and Raven Simone. There were a lot of people, basically anyone who had any relevance during the 90s, including my Uncle Vinny, who had a grunge band in the 90s, which got a couple hits.
I'm Vinny. From the band Sponge.
Never heard of ya.
Oh.
But the big thing that made the show so successful was it catered to a niche audience that ended up being very lucrative. You know, they pioneered the way of absurd humor, surrealism, meme culture, the nihilistic viewpoint of the millennial generation. It was started here. It was cool, it was hip, it was different, it was unpolished, it was honest. And people liked it. It was genuine. You know, I mean, you can look at this show and just say that it's not good, but you have to understand how much wouldn't have happened had the show never existed. And I think what's most important to take away from the show is that if you want to do something, if you want to create something, don't let the limitations of what you don't have stop you. Like, you can create a great thing from very minimal resources. In fact, I think that sometimes limitation can inspire the greatest innovations. You know, just because you don't have a DSLR camera doesn't mean that you can't make a YouTube video. In fact, this is a point and shoot that happens to be dying at the moment. Just because you don't have millions of dollars doesn't mean you can't make a great movie. Doesn't mean you can't tell a great story. And doesn't mean that you can't make something amazing. Use what you have at your disposal to make something great, to make something you'll be proud of, and to make something that represents you. Introduce new ideas with it, and maybe you can influence the next generation just like Space Ghost did. Thank you for watching Let's Talk with Tom on the Roundtable, but Tom isn't just on the Roundtable. I have my own self-titled personal channel, I have a Twitter, I have an Instagram, I have a Snapchat, I have all that good stuff. In fact, I even have a Tumblr. So, if you're interested in any of that, check that out, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye!